Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the winter of 1890, in the industrial Pennsylvania city of Pittsburgh, pharmacist Mr. Albert Brennan was found dead in his pharmacy from what appeared to be accidental poisoning from exposure to toxic substances in his workspace. Brennan had operated Brennan's Pharmacy in Pittsburgh's Allegheny district for 12 years, dispensing medications, compounding prescriptions, and serving as a trusted healthcare provider for hundreds of working-class families in the growing industrial city. His death seemed to be an occupational tragedy of a pharmacist who had succumbed to the hazards inherent in handling dangerous substances daily. But when authorities entered Brennan's pharmacy to inventory his stock of controlled substances and to secure his financial records, they discovered something that would transform his death from a workplace accident into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Pennsylvania history. Hidden in a locked drawer in Brennan's private office was a detailed ledger documenting 12 years of what Brennan called his special preparations, custom poison mixtures that he had sold to customers who wanted substances to kill people, animals, or pests, with Brennan deliberately providing poisons that were untraceable or that mimicked natural illness, and keeping meticulous records of who had purchased what poisons and for what stated purposes. The ledger contained more than 400 entries documenting poison sales over 12 years. The entries included customer names, dates of purchase, types of poisons sold, stated purposes for the poisons, and in many cases Brennan's own notes about whether the customer's stated purpose seemed truthful or whether Brennan suspected the poison would be used for murder. The ledger revealed that Albert Brennan had been knowingly selling poisons to people he believed intended to commit murder, had been advising customers on how to administer poisons without detection, and had been profiting from what amounted to systematic facilitation of poisoning deaths throughout Pittsburgh. The investigation triggered by discovery of Brennan's ledger was massive and horrifying. Police cross-referenced the names in the ledger against unsolved deaths and suspicious deaths over the previous 12 years, attempting to determine how many murders Brennan had facilitated through his poison sales. The investigation eventually identified at least 37 deaths that appeared to be connected to poisons purchased from Brennan's pharmacy, with the actual number likely much higher, given that many poison deaths had probably been misattributed to natural causes and had never been investigated as suspicious. Brennan's ledger entries showed sophisticated understanding of toxicology and of how poisons could be used to kill while avoiding detection. He documented selling arsenic, disguised as digestive powders, selling strychnine, with instructions for administering it in ways that would mimic seizures or heart attacks, selling belladonna and other plant-based poisons that would cause symptoms easily confused with common illnesses. He recorded advising customers about dosages, about timing of administration, and about how to dispose of evidence. In essence, Brennan had operated as a consultant for murder, using his pharmaceutical expertise to help customers kill people while minimizing risk of detection. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Albert Brennan and the 12 years he spent selling poisons and facilitating murders in Pittsburgh, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries daily, because what was found in that ledger raises profound questions about professional ethics, about the responsibility of those with access to dangerous substances, and about how someone in a healing profession could so completely pervert that calling by knowingly helping people commit murder for profit. Pittsburgh in the 1870s through 1890s was a rapidly industrializing city, with a population approaching 300,000 people, serving as a center for steel production, coal mining, and heavy manufacturing. The city had substantial immigrant working-class populations living in crowded conditions with high rates of disease, injury, and death from both industrial accidents and from poverty-related illnesses. Pharmacies served crucial roles as accessible healthcare providers for working-class families who couldn't afford doctors, with pharmacists diagnosing common ailments and recommending or compounding medications without requiring physician prescriptions. Albert Brennan had established his pharmacy in Pittsburgh's Allegheny district in 1878 at age 35, after completing pharmaceutical training in Philadelphia and after working briefly in other pharmacies. His credentials were legitimate, his prices were reasonable for working-class customers, and he quickly built a successful practice, serving the neighborhood's predominantly Irish and German immigrant families. Brennan was known as a competent pharmacist who kept long hours, who would make house calls to deliver medications to sick patients, and who extended credit to customers struggling financially. But Brennan's ledger, which he began keeping shortly after opening his pharmacy, reveals a second practice, operating alongside his legitimate pharmaceutical business. The ledger's first entry, dated August 1878, documents selling arsenic to a customer who claimed she needed it for killing rats, but whom Brennan noted appeared more concerned with human ailment than rodent problem. This first entry shows Brennan was suspicious about the customer's true purpose, but had sold the poison anyway, establishing the pattern that would continue for 12 years. The ledger entries became more explicit and more disturbing over time. Early entries show Brennan maintaining some plausible deniability by accepting customers' stated purposes for poisons without explicit acknowledgement that he knew they intended murder. But later entries show Brennan actively participating in planning poisonings, offering unsolicited advice about how to administer poisons effectively, and even discussing with customers which poisons would be most suitable for their particular situations, based on factors like the victim's health condition, the desired timeline for death, and the level of scrutiny the death might receive. The customers who purchased poisons from Brennan represented a cross-section of Pittsburgh's population. The ledger documented sales to wives wanting to kill abusive or unfaithful husbands, to husbands wanting to kill wives to marry other women, or to collect life insurance, to adult children wanting to kill elderly parents to inherit property, to business partners wanting to eliminate rivals, to tenants wanting to kill difficult landlords. Brennan sold poisons across class lines to wealthy customers and to poor customers, to native-born Americans and to immigrants, to people of various ages and occupations. What united Brennan's customers was that they wanted someone dead, and they believed poison was the safest method for accomplishing murder. Brennan's pharmaceutical expertise, his access to toxic substances, and his willingness to provide both materials and advice made him an enabler for dozens of murderers who might not have been able to obtain appropriate poisons, or who might not have known how to use them effectively without his assistance. The types of poisons Brennan sold followed patterns based on his understanding of what would work effectively, while minimizing detection risk. Arsenic was the most common poison in his ledger, appearing in more than half of the documented sales. Arsenic was readily available in the 1880s for legitimate purposes including pesticide use and manufacturing, could be purchased without raising immediate suspicion, and when administered in appropriate doses caused symptoms that could be mistaken for cholera, food poisoning, or other common illnesses. Brennan sold arsenic in various forms including white arsenic powder that could be mixed into food, and arsenic-based rat poisons that could be extracted and concentrated. Strychnine was the second most common poison in Brennan's ledger. Strychnine caused violent convulsions and death that could be attributed to seizure disorders or to tetanus, both of which were common in the 1880s and wouldn't necessarily trigger suspicion. Brennan documented selling strychnine with specific instructions about dosage. Too much would cause symptoms too dramatic to be mistaken for natural causes, while the right amount would cause death that appeared consistent with various medical conditions. Other poisons Brennan sold included belladonna and other plant-based toxins that affected the nervous system and caused symptoms similar to various illnesses, mercury compounds that caused symptoms similar to industrial poisoning, which was common in Pittsburgh's heavy manufacturing environment, and chloral hydrate, which could be used to incapacitate victims before administering other poisons, or could cause death through overdose, that might be attributed to accidental misuse of the substance as a sleep aid. Brennan's ledger documented his pricing structure for poisons, revealing that he charged premium prices for special preparations compared to what he charged for the same substances when sold for legitimate purposes. A purchase of arsenic for stated rat-killing purposes might cost 25 cents, while the same quantity sold with Brennan's advice about administering it to humans would cost $2 or more. This price differential showed that Brennan understood he was providing specialized criminal consulting services beyond just selling substances, and that he was charging accordingly for his expertise and for the risk he was taking by knowingly facilitating murder. The ledger also documented repeat customers, people who returned to Brennan multiple times to purchase poisons for different victims, or who needed additional quantities when initial amounts proved insufficient to kill their targets. Some entries show Brennan discussing with customers why their first poisoning attempt had failed, and advising them on adjustments to make subsequent attempts more successful. These repeat customer entries showed that Brennan wasn't just passively selling substances to anyone who asked, but was actively engaged in ongoing relationships with customers, where he served as their poison consultant across multiple murder attempts. Brennan's notes in the ledger reveal his psychological state and his rationalizations for his actions. He wrote repeatedly about his belief that he was providing a service to people who were trapped in intolerable situations, abused wives with no legal means of escaping violent husbands, desperately poor people who needed inheritance money to survive, people in situations where murder seemed to be their only solution. Brennan presented himself in his ledger as a pragmatist who recognized that people would obtain and use poisons whether he helped them or not, and who therefore chose to help them do it safely and effectively, rather than forcing them to use more dangerous or painful methods. This rationalization was clearly self-serving and ignored the fundamental fact that Brennan was facilitating murder and profiting from it. His victims weren't just the people who were poisoned, they were also the customers who might not have committed murder without his encouragement and assistance, and they were the broader community whose safety was undermined by a pharmacist who was willing to help anyone commit murder for the right price. The discovery of Brennan's ledger came about through random chance, rather than through deliberate investigation of his practices. Police had entered the pharmacy to secure controlled substances after his death, and had initially planned just to inventory his stock and to transfer dangerous materials to secure storage. But the officer conducting the inventory had noticed the locked drawer in Brennan's office, had forced it open expecting to find cash or valuable documents, and had instead found the ledger. The officer's decision to read through the ledger, rather than just securing it, had led to recognition of what it documented, and had triggered the massive investigation that followed. The investigation to determine how many murders Brennan had facilitated was complicated by several factors. Many of the deaths that had resulted from Brennan's poisons had occurred years earlier, making evidence collection difficult or impossible. Bodies that had been buried might be exhumed for toxicology testing, but decomposition often made poison detection impossible. Death certificates from the 1880s often listed causes of death vaguely: natural causes, heart failure, convulsions, without the specificity needed to identify which deaths might have been poisonings. The ledger entries didn't always include complete names or addresses for customers, with Brennan sometimes using only first names or nicknames, especially for customers he considered particularly dangerous or whose crimes he wanted to maintain deniability about. Cross-referencing partial names against death records required extensive detective work, and in many cases investigators couldn't definitively determine which ledger entries corresponded to which actual deaths. Some of the people named in the ledger as poison purchasers had died themselves in the years since purchasing poisons from Brennan, making it impossible to question them about what they had done with the substances they purchased. Some had left Pittsburgh and couldn't be located. Some denied purchasing poisons when questioned, claiming Brennan must have fabricated ledger entries though this claim seemed implausible given that Brennan had no obvious motive to create false records of illegal activities that would incriminate him if discovered. The investigation eventually identified 37 deaths, where evidence strongly suggested the deceased had been poisoned with substances purchased from Brennan's pharmacy, where people named in Brennan's ledger had clear motives and opportunities to poison those who died, and where circumstances of death matched patterns Brennan had described in his ledger entries. These 37 cases represented a minimum number. The investigation concluded that the actual death toll from Brennan's poison sales was likely much higher, possibly exceeding 100 deaths over 12 years, but that many poison deaths had been so successfully disguised as natural causes that they would never be identified. The criminal prosecution of surviving poison purchasers whose names appeared in Brennan's ledger was complicated by legal and evidentiary challenges. Brennan's ledger entries were hearsay that might not be admissible as evidence in court. Proving that someone had purchased poison was not the same as proving they had used it to commit murder. Defendants could argue they had purchased poison for legitimate purposes and had never used it, or that they had used it for the stated purpose of pest control. Convicting poison purchasers required additional evidence beyond the ledger entries, such as witness testimony about suspicious circumstances around deaths, or toxicology results showing poison in exhumed bodies. Despite these challenges, prosecutors eventually brought murder charges against 18 people whose names appeared in Brennan's ledger, and whose alleged victims showed evidence of poisoning upon exhumation and toxicology testing. The trials were sensational, with newspapers covering them extensively, and with public outrage focused both on the murderers and on Brennan, who had enabled their crimes. Of the 18 people charged, 12 were eventually convicted of murder or manslaughter, with sentences ranging from long prison terms to execution. The convictions provided some measure of justice, but still left dozens of murders that Brennan had facilitated where perpetrators were never identified or charged. The question of how Brennan had been able to operate for 12 years selling poisons and facilitating murders without being detected or reported was investigated thoroughly. The investigation revealed multiple systemic failures that had allowed Brennan to continue his criminal practice. Pharmacy regulation in the 1880s was minimal, with little oversight of what substances pharmacists sold or to whom they sold them. Brennan's legitimate pharmaceutical business provided cover for his illegal poison sales. Anyone observing him selling substances wouldn't necessarily know whether the sale was legitimate or criminal. The social isolation and distrust in working-class immigrant communities meant that people who suspected their neighbors might be murderers were often reluctant to report suspicions to authorities. The high background death rate from disease and industrial accidents in 1880s Pittsburgh meant that additional deaths from poisoning might not have stood out as unusual enough to trigger investigation. And crucially, the medical knowledge needed to identify poison deaths and to distinguish them from natural deaths was limited, with many doctors not trained in toxicology, and with post-mortem examinations being rare except in obviously suspicious deaths. Brennan's death from what appeared to be accidental poisoning was investigated to determine whether it had actually been suicide to avoid prosecution if he suspected his crimes were about to be discovered, or whether someone who had purchased poisons from him might have decided to eliminate him to prevent him from providing evidence about their crimes. The investigation was inconclusive. Brennan had been exposed to toxic substances regularly in his pharmaceutical work, making accidental poisoning plausible, but the timing of his death, occurring when at least one customer was being questioned by police about suspicious circumstances around a death, and might have implicated Brennan, suggested that either suicide or murder were also plausible explanations. The psychological profile of Albert Brennan that emerged from his ledger and from accounts of people who had known him suggested someone with apparently normal surface presentation, who had severe lack of empathy, and who had compartmentalized his criminal activities from his legitimate professional work. Neighbors and customers from his legitimate pharmacy practice described him as competent and helpful, but his ledger revealed someone who could discuss the mechanics of murder dispassionately, who could advise customers on how to kill people efficiently, and who apparently felt no moral qualms about profiting from facilitating dozens of murders. Modern psychological understanding might classify Brennan as having psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, instrumental view of other people as means to his ends, and ability to maintain dual presentations as respectable professional and as criminal facilitator. His rationalization that he was providing a service to people in desperate situations demonstrated the kind of self-serving justification that allows people to commit serious crimes while maintaining positive self-image. The impact on Pittsburgh's community was severe and lasting. The revelation that a trusted pharmacist had been facilitating murders for 12 years destroyed trust in pharmacies and pharmacists, with many people reluctant to purchase any substances from pharmacies for fear they might be given poisons, either intentionally or through negligence. The realization that dozens of deaths over 12 years had been murders rather than natural deaths created pervasive anxiety and suspicion. Families wondered whether their relatives' deaths had been natural or had been poisonings facilitated by Brennan. Families of identified poison victims experienced complex trauma. They grieved anew for relatives they had thought died naturally, but who had actually been murdered. They experienced rage at the murderers and at Brennan, who had enabled the murders. In many cases, they experienced guilt for not having recognized at the time that their relatives were being poisoned, even though the symptoms had been designed to mimic natural illness, and even though they had no reason to suspect murder. The murderers' families also experienced trauma and stigma. Children whose parents were convicted of murder, based on evidence from Brennan's ledger, carried lasting shame and social stigma. Communities shunned families associated with convicted murderers, creating intergenerational consequences extending beyond the immediate perpetrators and victims of the poisoning murders. The regulatory response to the Brennan case included Pennsylvania passing stronger regulations governing pharmacy practice and poison sales. The new regulations required pharmacists to maintain records of poison sales in official ledgers that would be subject to periodic inspection by authorities, required customers purchasing poisons to provide identification and to state purposes for purchases, and prohibited pharmacists from selling certain highly toxic substances except with physician prescriptions. These regulations were intended to make it more difficult for pharmacists to facilitate murders and easier for authorities to detect patterns of suspicious poison sales. Similar regulations were adopted in other states, following publicity about the Brennan case, contributing to broader reform of pharmacy regulation nationwide. The case demonstrated clearly that lack of oversight of poison sales created opportunities for abuse that could result in numerous murders going undetected for years. While the new regulations weren't perfect and still allowed determined murderers to obtain poisons, they represented significant improvement over the essentially unregulated environment that had allowed Brennan to operate freely. The pharmaceutical profession's response to the Brennan case included adopting stronger ethical codes, emphasizing pharmacists' duties to refuse sales when they suspected substances would be used for illegal purposes, and to report suspicious patterns to authorities. Professional pharmacy organizations condemned Brennan's actions as extreme betrayal of professional ethics and worked to distance the profession from his crimes. Some pharmacists faced harassment and suspicion from communities that had difficulty trusting any pharmacist after learning about Brennan's facilitation of murders. The few photographs that exist of Albert Brennan show a professionally dressed man with serious expression, appearing competent and trustworthy in ways that helped him maintain his legitimate pharmaceutical business while conducting his illegal poison sales. The photographs illustrate how professional appearance and credentials can mask criminal behavior, and how trust based on professional role can be exploited by those willing to betray that trust for profit. The pharmacy building where Brennan had operated was closed immediately after discovery of his crimes, with the business and building eventually sold to new owners who completely renovated it and reopened it under new name and management. The new owners faced significant challenges rebuilding community trust given the building's association with Brennan's crimes. Some customers refused to use the pharmacy regardless of new ownership and management, unable to separate the physical location from memories of what had occurred there. The ledger itself was preserved as evidence and eventually was archived in Pennsylvania state records with restricted access. Researchers studying poisoning crimes, pharmaceutical history, and criminal psychology have accessed the ledger, reporting that it provides disturbing detailed documentation of systematic facilitation of murder spanning 12 years. The ledger's preservation allows continued study, while restricting access to prevent it from serving as an instruction manual for aspiring poisoners. The question of whether other pharmacists in Pittsburgh or elsewhere might have engaged in similar practices of knowingly selling poisons for murder became source of concern and investigation. Reviews of other pharmacies' records and of suspicious death patterns didn't identify clear evidence of other pharmacists operating on Brennan's scale, but the investigations did reveal that some suspicious poison sales had occurred and that oversight of pharmacy practice had been inadequate to prevent abuses. The Brennan case demonstrated that what one person had done, others might also do, requiring vigilance and oversight rather than blind trust in professional integrity. The legal precedent established by prosecutions based on Brennan's ledger influenced how future cases involving facilitation of murder by providing means and methods would be handled. The cases established that someone who knowingly provides assistance to murderers can be prosecuted as an accomplice, even if they don't personally administer the poison or commit the murder directly. This precedent strengthened ability to prosecute enablers of murder, though proving knowledge and intent remain challenging. The memorial erected in Pittsburgh Cemetery in 1895 to victims of poison murders facilitated by Brennan lists names of 37 identified victims, but acknowledges that many more, whose deaths were attributed to natural causes, were also victims of criminal poisoning. The memorial serves as reminder of harm caused by Brennan's crimes and as commitment to preventing similar systemic facilitation of murder in the future. Modern discussions of pharmaceutical ethics and of responsibilities of healthcare professionals who have access to dangerous substances often reference the Brennan case as extreme example of professional betrayal. The case illustrates importance of ethical standards that require healthcare professionals to refuse to provide means for murder, even when such refusal might cost business, and of oversight systems that can detect patterns of suspicious behavior by professionals with access to dangerous materials. The comparison between Brennan's deliberate facilitation of murder through poison sales and modern concerns about professionals who might enable harm through overprescribing controlled substances, through failing to report suspicious patterns of substance purchases, or through otherwise abusing their professional access to dangerous materials, raises questions about what oversight and accountability mechanisms are needed to protect public safety while allowing legitimate professional practice. The descendants of victims of murders facilitated by Brennan's poison sales carried intergenerational trauma and knowledge that their ancestors had been murdered rather than dying naturally. Some descendants conducted research trying to understand exactly how their relatives had died and who had killed them. Others preferred not to know details, finding it less painful to maintain some uncertainty about circumstances of deaths rather than confronting full reality of how their relatives had suffered. The question of what had motivated Brennan to begin selling poisons for murder, and to continue doing so for 12 years, despite significant risks, was never fully answered. His ledger documented his stated rationalizations, but didn't provide deep insight into his psychology or into what had led him to begin facilitating murders in the first place. Whether he had started out intending to provide criminal services, or whether he had gradually drifted into it after initial questionable sales led to more explicit criminal activity remained unclear. The financial analysis of Brennan's estate revealed that his illegal poison sales had been highly profitable, with the premium prices he charged for special preparations generating significant income beyond what his legitimate pharmaceutical business provided. The profit motive clearly played a role in sustaining his criminal activities over 12 years, though whether profit was his primary motivation, or whether he also derived psychological satisfaction from facilitating murders remained unclear from available evidence. The impact on medical jurisprudence and on investigation of suspicious deaths was significant. The Brennan case demonstrated how easily poison deaths could be misattributed to natural causes when medical examiners weren't trained in toxicology and when post-mortem examinations weren't conducted routinely. The case contributed to growing recognition that professional death investigation, including routine toxicology screening, was necessary to detect murders that were disguised as natural deaths. The development of improved methods for detecting poisons in human tissue, including methods for identifying poisons in bodies that had been buried for years, was partly motivated by need to investigate deaths potentially connected to Brennan's poison sales. The advances in forensic toxicology that resulted from the Brennan case and from similar cases helped make poison less attractive as a murder method, since murderers could no longer be as confident that poison use would go undetected. The psychological impact on surviving murderers who had purchased poisons from Brennan and who had successfully killed their victims without being caught was impossible to assess directly, but court testimony from those who were eventually prosecuted provided some insight. Some expressed remorse for their crimes and relief at finally being held accountable after years of guilt. Others showed no remorse and expressed only anger at being caught. The varying responses demonstrated that people who commit murder aren't psychologically uniform, but include both those who develop guilt and those who remain unconcerned about harm they caused. The question of whether Brennan had kept his ledger as insurance against being betrayed by his customers, documentation he could use to threaten them if they attempted to expose him, or whether he had kept it simply as record-keeping for his own purposes was debated. The ledger's existence created mutual vulnerability between Brennan and his customers, where each held information that could destroy the other, creating unstable equilibrium that had apparently held for 12 years until Brennan's death exposed the records. The few surviving letters from people who had known Brennan described their shock at learning about his crimes and their difficulty reconciling the helpful pharmacist they had known with the criminal facilitator documented in the ledger. This cognitive dissonance, the struggle to integrate seemingly contradictory information about someone's character, is common when trusted community members are revealed to have committed serious crimes. The letters illustrate how difficult it is for people to recognize criminality in those who present professional and respectable facades. The broader cultural impact of the Brennan case on American attitudes towards pharmacists and toward access to dangerous substances was difficult to quantify, but probably contributed to growing support for professional regulation and for controls on poison sales. While pharmacists remain generally trusted healthcare providers, the Brennan case served as a reminder that professional credentials and community standing didn't guarantee ethical behavior, and that oversight and accountability were necessary to protect public safety. The archive of materials related to the Brennan case, including his ledger, investigation reports, trial transcripts, and toxicology reports from exhumed bodies, remains preserved in Pennsylvania State Archives with restricted access. The materials provide comprehensive documentation of systematic facilitation of murder over 12 years and of the investigation and prosecutions that followed. Researchers who have accessed these materials report that they are as disturbing as historical accounts suggest, providing detailed evidence of how trusted professional used his position to facilitate dozens of murders. The lessons from the Brennan case remain relevant in contemporary discussions about professional ethics, about regulation of access to dangerous materials, about how to balance professional autonomy with public safety oversight, and about how to maintain public trust in professions that provide essential services, while also having access to materials that could be misused for harmful purposes. The case demonstrated that trust in professionals requires not just individual integrity, but also systemic safeguards that make abuse difficult even when individual integrity fails. Brennan was able to facilitate murders for 12 years because he operated without meaningful oversight, because poison sales weren't regulated or monitored, because death investigation was inadequate to detect most poison murders, and because customers who might have informed on him were implicated in his crimes, and therefore couldn't report him without incriminating themselves. Modern professional practices that require documentation of substance sales, that mandate reporting of suspicious patterns, that provide for regular inspection of pharmacy records, and that conduct thorough death investigations, including routine toxicology screening, reflect recognition that trust alone is insufficient protection, and that multiple layers of oversight and accountability are needed to prevent abuses by professionals with access to dangerous materials. The memorial services held for identified victims of poison murders facilitated by Brennan provided some community healing and acknowledgement of harm that had been done. The services allowed families to gather, to share their grief and anger, and to begin processing trauma of learning that their relatives had been murdered. The community support represented in these services was important for victims' families, who had initially grieved what they thought were natural deaths, and now had to grieve again, knowing their relatives had been murdered. The case of Albert Brennan and his 12 years of selling poisons and facilitating murders in Pittsburgh stands as one of the most extensive documented cases of systematic enablement of murder by a trusted healthcare professional in American history. The more than 400 ledger entries documenting poison sales, the at least 37 confirmed murder victims, and the unknown additional number of deaths that were successfully disguised as natural causes represent catastrophic betrayal of the healing profession and of the trust that communities place in pharmacists to use their knowledge and their access to dangerous substances responsibly. The victims who died from poisons purchased from Brennan's pharmacy suffered in ways their families initially attributed to illness, but later learned were the results of deliberate murder, facilitated by a pharmacist who provided both materials and advice to help murderers kill effectively while avoiding detection. Some victims' final days involved suffering symptoms that families thought indicated natural disease, but that actually indicated systematic poisoning by people they trusted, a betrayal compounded by Brennan's professional betrayal of enabling those murders. What happened in that Pittsburgh pharmacy between 1878 and 1890? The systematic sale of poisons to customers Brennan knew intended murder, the provision of expertise about how to administer poisons effectively and avoid detection, the 12-year criminal practice that operated alongside legitimate pharmaceutical business, stands as testament to how professional authority and access can be exploited for profit and to enable harm, to how inadequate oversight allows systematic crime to continue undetected, and to why healthcare professions require not just technical competence, but also ethical integrity and accountability systems that protect patients and communities from those who would betray professional trust to facilitate murder.